If you think you know how this story ends, think again. This isn't just about a man in simple clothes walking into an interview. It's about the lesson that would leave an entire company stunned, embarrassed, and changed forever. Stay with me until the end to see how one man's quiet strength changed everything. His name was Brian Carter. Brian had always believed that true worth was not written on your clothes or your shoes. It was something you carried within. But not everyone saw the world that way. Brian had spent most of his life building his small company from scratch. He wasn't flashy. He didn't drive expensive cars or wear custom-tailored suits. In fact, when Brian sold his first business a few years ago, he decided to stay low-key. He liked it that way. Now, he had decided it was time for a new challenge. He wanted to buy a struggling company, fix its problems, and rebuild it the right way. And there it was. Stratton Technologies. It was a mid-sized tech company that had lost its way. The workers were talented, but the leadership was broken. Brian saw it as an opportunity, but he didn't want to announce himself. He wanted to see the company from the inside first. So he did something most people would never dare to do. He applied for an open position, a simple position, just to feel the real heart of the company. He wore a basic gray shirt, slightly wrinkled jeans, and old sneakers. He didn't shave that morning. He didn't comb his hair in any special way. He wanted them to judge him not by his looks, but by his words, his experience, and his ideas. The receptionist barely looked up when Brian walked into the building. She handed him a clipboard without saying a word. Other candidates, dressed in shiny suits and expensive watches, laughed and whispered when they saw him. Some even took pictures of him from the corner of their phones. Brian smiled politely and sat down, filling out the form with simple, neat handwriting. An hour passed. 2 hours. No one called his name. He could feel the stares, the smirks, the judgment in the room. Still, he waited patiently. Finally, a man in a sharp navy blue suit stepped out from the glass doors. His name was Derek Walters, the hiring manager. Derek looked around the room, his eyes sliding right past Brian, as if he didn't exist. He called out 2 other names, inviting the candidates inside. Another hour passed. Brian stood up and approached the front desk. "Excuse me," he said calmly. "I've been waiting for almost 3 hours. Is there any update?" The receptionist barely glanced at him. "There's been a change," she said coldly. "We are focusing on candidates who fit the company image." Brian paused for a moment, his heart steady. "May I still have a chance to speak with someone?" he asked. The receptionist sighed heavily, picked up the phone, and muttered something. After a few minutes, Derek stormed out, looking annoyed. "This isn't a charity," Derek snapped. "We don't waste time with people who can't even respect a professional setting." Brian looked him straight in the eyes. "I'm here because I believe I can bring real value to Stratton Technologies." Derek laughed, a sharp, mocking sound. "Value? Look at you. You're a joke. Get out of here." The room fell silent. Other candidates watched, some with wide eyes, some chuckling under their breath. Without another word, Brian nodded slowly, turned around, and walked toward the door. But just as he reached it, a woman's voice stopped him. "Wait," she said. Her name was Rachel Martin. She worked in the HR department but had no real authority. Still, something about the way Brian carried himself made her uncomfortable with how he was being treated. Derek cut her off sharply. "Rachel, don't waste your time. We have real candidates to interview." Brian didn't want to cause a scene. He simply smiled at Rachel, nodded his thanks, and walked out into the bright afternoon sun. Inside the building, Derek laughed loudly. "Did you see that guy?" he said to another manager. "Probably walked in off the street." The other manager chuckled, not knowing the storm that was about to hit them. Because the next day, everything changed. At exactly 9 a.m., a black car pulled into the Stratton Technologies parking lot. A man stepped out, the same man they had thrown out the day before. But this time, Brian wasn't wearing jeans and sneakers. He wore a clean, well-fitted suit, not flashy, but professional. Next to him walked two lawyers and a representative from the board of investors. Because what no one at Stratton Technologies realized was that Brian had already bought 60% of the company's shares, and today was the day he was coming to take over. Inside the building, Derek was holding another round of interviews when his phone buzzed. He ignored it. Then it buzzed again, and again. Annoyed, he finally answered. "You need to come to the conference room. Now." The voice on the other end didn't sound like a request. Derek hurried down the hall, straightening his tie. He walked into the conference room and froze. There sat Brian at the head of the table, calm and composed. Next to him were the lawyers and the board representative. The CEO of Stratton Technologies, Mr. Leonard Briggs, stood awkwardly near the window, pale as a sheet. Brian spoke first. "Good morning, everyone," he said smoothly. "For those who don't know, my name is Brian Carter. As of yesterday, I am now the majority shareholder of Stratton Technologies." Dead silence filled the room. Derek's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Brian continued. "Today, we're going to have a meeting about the future of this company. Some changes will be made. Some positions will be reconsidered." Brian's eyes met Derek's directly. "And I always believed that how a company treats the least impressive-looking person says everything about its soul." Derek's face turned a deep shade of red. Rachel, standing quietly near the back, tried to hide a small smile. She remembered how Brian had thanked her politely, even after being humiliated. Brian turned to the others. "But before we begin, I would like to share a story about my first visit here." He leaned back comfortably in the chair, like a king surveying his court. He smiled slightly before speaking. "Yesterday, I came here dressed as a regular man, applying for a basic job. I wanted to see this company through fresh eyes. I wanted to feel how people are treated when they have no power and no big title." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. "I was mocked. I was judged by my clothes. I was laughed at. I was thrown out. Some people in the room shifted uncomfortably in their chairs." Brian continued. "I believe that companies succeed not because of fancy offices or expensive suits, but because of respect, hard work, and real talent." He looked around the table, meeting each person's eyes. "Today, we start fresh. I will not fire everyone. That is not my goal. But we will make some important changes." He opened a folder in front of him. "First, I will be meeting every department head, one by one. We will talk about your roles, your goals, and your teams. Based on those talks, we will decide who stays and who needs to move on." The room was silent. Everyone sat frozen. Brian pointed toward Derek. "But some decisions are easier than others." Derek stiffened. Brian spoke directly to him. "Effective immediately, Derek Walters. You are relieved of your duties. Security will assist you." Derek's face turned from red to pale in seconds. "You can't do this," Derek stuttered. Brian's voice was steady. "I already have." Within minutes, two security officers entered quietly and stood by the door. Derek stood up, rage flashing across his face. He opened his mouth to argue, but then thought better of it. Without another word, he grabbed his briefcase and stormed out. Brian turned back to the table. Let that be the last time someone is treated unfairly in this company because of how they look. Rachel, standing against the wall, felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Many others in the room did too, but no one dared show it yet. Brian closed the folder and leaned back slightly. I didn't buy Stratton Technologies because I needed more money. I bought it because I believe it can be something better. I see great potential here, hidden under bad habits. He glanced at his watch. Today will be a busy day. Department heads, please be ready to meet with me one by one starting in 15 minutes. He stood up. You are dismissed for now. The employees filed out of the room quietly, some whispering among themselves, some simply too shocked to speak. Rachel stayed behind. Brian looked at her and gave a small smile. Thank you, he said. Rachel shook her head. I didn't do much, she replied softly. You did more than you know, Brian answered. He appreciated her simple kindness more than she could imagine. As the day went on, Brian held meeting after meeting. He listened carefully to each department head. Some were passionate, hard-working, and sincere. Others clearly cared more about office politics than real work. Brian made quiet notes during every conversation. He wasn't interested in firing people without cause. He was interested in building a team that respected each other and focused on real results. One by one, decisions were made. Some managers were offered coaching and new goals. A few were offered generous severance packages to move on quietly. Word spread through the company like wildfire. By the end of the day, people began to realize that Brian wasn't just some rich man playing games. He was serious, smart, and surprisingly fair. He wasn't looking for perfect resumes. He was looking for honesty, dedication, and teamwork. Over the next week, small changes started to appear. The front desk got a new receptionist, someone who smiled and treated every visitor kindly. The interview process was reworked to focus on skills, not appearances. Team meetings were held where everyone, not just managers, could offer ideas. People started to feel a spark of hope. Something different was happening. But not everyone was happy. There was a group of senior employees who felt threatened by the changes. They had been used to doing things their own way for years. They whispered in corners, spread rumors, and tried to resist quietly. Brian knew about them, but he didn't confront them right away. He believed in giving people a chance to choose the right path. One afternoon, as Brian walked through the office, he overheard a few of them talking. Give it a few months, one man said. He'll get bored and leave. They always do. Brian smiled to himself and kept walking. He had no plans to leave. He was just getting started. The following Monday, Brian called for a company-wide meeting. Everyone gathered in the main hall, standing shoulder to shoulder. Brian stood at the front, microphone in hand. Good morning, he said simply. Many of you have asked what the future of Stratton Technologies will look like. He paused. The future starts today. He clicked a remote, and a screen behind him lit up with simple words. Respect, responsibility, results. These are the 3 pillars we will build our company on, Brian said. He explained each one. Respect, treating every person inside and outside the company with dignity. Responsibility, owning your work and being accountable. Results, focusing on real outcomes, not appearances or empty promises. Titles mean less than actions, Brian said. Your worth here will be based on what you bring to the table, your ideas, your effort, your teamwork. He finished with one simple line. If you are here to build something great, you have my full support. If you are here just for comfort, you may not find it here anymore. The room was dead silent. Then slowly a few people started to clap. Then more. Within seconds, the hall was filled with applause. Rachel smiled from the second row. She could see it, the start of something real. Brian didn't bask in the praise. He simply nodded and stepped down. After the meeting, employees came up to him, people he had never met, to shake his hand and say thank you. Not everyone, of course. The small group of senior troublemakers watched from a distance, their faces tight. They were already planning their next move. And Brian knew it. But he was ready. Because he wasn't just here to fix a company. Over the next few weeks, things moved fast at Stratton Technologies. Teams were restructured. New ideas were encouraged. Projects that had been stuck for years finally started moving forward. Brian spent time on every floor, talking with employees, learning names, hearing ideas. People started to believe in the company again. But behind the scenes, the group of senior employees who felt threatened were not sitting quietly. They met in private late after hours, whispering about how to push Brian out. At the center of the group was a man named Victor. Victor had been with the company for nearly 20 years. He was respected once, but over time he had become bitter and lazy. He didn't like being challenged. He didn't like someone new changing the rules he had lived by. Victor believed that if they made Brian's job harder, he would eventually give up and leave. Their first plan was simple. They started spreading quiet lies. They told new employees that Brian didn't really care about them, that all the changes were just for show, that soon the company would be sold again and everyone would be out of a job. At first, a few people believed the rumors. Fear is easy to spread when people are used to disappointment. But Brian noticed something was off. He saw the tension growing in small corners of the office. He saw new employees looking worried for no clear reason. So he decided to do something unexpected. One Friday afternoon, Brian called an open meeting. He stood in front of everyone with no microphone, no slides, no fancy speech. Just him. "I've heard there are a lot of rumors going around," he said calmly. A few people looked down at their feet. Others glanced around nervously. "I want you to hear the truth straight from me." He looked around the room. "I am not here to sell this company. I am not here to leave. I am here to rebuild with you. If anyone has questions, I will answer them now. No scripts, no lies." The room stayed quiet for a moment. Then one brave employee raised her hand. "Is it true we might all lose our jobs soon?" Brian shook his head. If anything, we are hiring more people to help us grow. We are not closing. We are building." Another hand went up. "Why did you fire some managers so quickly?" Brian answered simply. "Because they didn't respect the values we need. I will always choose people who work hard and treat others well, over people who just know how to look important." More questions came. Brian answered every single one with honesty and patience. The mood in the room slowly changed. By the end of the meeting, the employees felt stronger, not weaker. Victor and his group, standing near the back, realized their lies had failed. But they didn't give up. Next, they tried to slow down important projects. They missed deadlines. They forgot key meetings. They dragged their feet on decisions. They hoped that if progress stalled, Brian would look bad to the board members and investors. But Brian was not blind. He tracked every project closely, and when he saw the pattern, he took action. One morning, Brian walked into the project management office. He carried a simple list of names. He asked each project leader to step into his office one by one. He was firm but fair. He asked direct questions. Why is this project delayed? What is blocking your progress? How are you solving it? Some had real reasons, and Brian offered help immediately. More resources, better tools, direct support. But when he heard excuses without real answers, he made notes. When he finished the meetings, he called a second meeting with the senior managers. Victor and his group were there, trying to act casual. Brian stood calmly. I have spent the last 2 weeks watching closely. I have listened to every excuse. I have heard every reason. He placed a folder on the table. This folder holds the names of those who have chosen not to work toward our goals. He opened the folder and read out loud, one by one. Every name on the list was part of Victor's group. As of today, Brian said, your services are no longer required. The room froze. Victor stood up, furious. You can't just fire us all, he barked. Brian stayed calm. I can, and I have. Security was already waiting by the door. Victor stormed out, but not before throwing one last insult over his shoulder. You'll regret this. Brian didn't even flinch. He knew the storm would pass, and he knew that after the storm, real growth could finally begin. The next day, something incredible happened. For the first time in years, the office felt free. No more whispering, no more backstabbing, no more fear. People worked harder, smiled more, and shared ideas openly. Rachel came by Brian's office later that afternoon. You did the right thing, she said simply. Brian smiled. I didn't come this far to build on broken foundations. Rachel nodded. Everyone can feel it. It's different now. Better. Brian leaned back in his chair. There's still a lot to do, he said. But we're on the right path. Over the next few months, Stratton Technologies started to transform. Productivity soared. New products launched. Client satisfaction went up. The company gained a new reputation, not just for what it sold, but for how it treated people. Brian didn't take credit publicly. He always said it was the team. But inside, he knew the truth. It all started because he showed up as a simple man, because he wanted to see the real heart of the company, and because he refused to give up, even when it would have been easier to walk away. Late one evening, as Brian was about to leave the office, Rachel caught him by the elevators. There's someone here to see you, she said. At this hour? Brian asked, surprised. Rachel nodded. He said it's important. Brian walked back into the lobby. There, standing nervously, was a young man he didn't recognize. The man stepped forward. My name is Ethan, he said. I'm applying for a junior position. I know it's late, but I was hoping you might have a few minutes. Brian looked at the young man's worn shoes, his nervous hands, and the resume in his shaking fingers. He smiled. Come with me, Brian said warmly. Let's talk. Because Brian knew better than anyone that true potential often comes in unexpected packages, and he was ready to give it a chance. Just like he wished someone had done for him long ago. Brian and Ethan sat down in a quiet corner of the office. Ethan handed over his resume, still looking nervous. Brian took it without rushing. He read through it carefully, noticing a few spelling mistakes and an unusual work history. There were no famous schools listed, no big company names, just a few part-time jobs, some volunteer work, and a short explanation. My parents couldn't afford college, Ethan said softly, as if he already expected rejection. I tried to learn on my own. I'm not perfect. But I work hard. I just need a chance. Brian looked up at him. He remembered sitting in a similar chair years ago, saying almost the same words to people who had laughed at him. Brian leaned forward. What makes you want to work here? Ethan didn't have a perfect answer. He stumbled a little, searching for the right words. But what he said came from the heart. I want to be part of something good, Ethan said. I want to learn. I want to be useful. Brian smiled. Those were better answers than any fancy speech. He stood up and shook Ethan's hand. You're hired, Brian said. Ethan's eyes widened. Just like that? He asked, almost in disbelief. Brian nodded. Hard work matters here. Honesty matters. Titles don't. Ethan promised he would not let him down. And he didn't. Over the next year, Ethan grew faster than anyone expected. He asked questions. He stayed late. He helped others without being asked. Other employees noticed. Brian often smiled when he saw Ethan walking through the halls, full of energy, lifting the whole team's spirit without even realizing it. But Brian had bigger plans. One morning, he called Ethan into his office. Ethan sat down, nervous again, thinking maybe he had made a mistake. Brian chuckled. Relax, he said. You've done something rare here, Ethan. You've inspired people without even trying. Ethan looked confused. I'm just doing my best. And that's exactly why it matters, Brian said. He pulled out a new badge from his desk. It had Ethan's name on it, and underneath, a new title, Team Supervisor. Ethan's mouth dropped open. I'm not qualified, he started to say. Brian held up a hand. You are. You care. You work hard. That's what we need. Ethan accepted the badge, his hands shaking. He could barely speak. That promotion sent a powerful message to the whole company. At Stratton Technologies, the old rules were gone. Your past didn't matter as much as your heart. Your fancy degrees didn't matter more than your effort. The news about the company's culture started to spread outside. New talents began applying. Clients trusted the company more, and investors who once doubted the future now wanted to be part of it. One evening, the board of directors called a special meeting. They praised Brian for the incredible turnaround. Sales were up. Employee retention was at an all-time high. Customer satisfaction surveys showed record numbers. But more importantly, the company was alive again. The board chairman stood up and spoke clearly. You've not just saved Stratton Technologies, Brian. You've made it something greater than it ever was before. Brian stood humbly and said only one thing. I didn't do it alone. He meant every word. The success belonged to every hard-working employee who believed change was possible. And it all started with a simple man being thrown out of an interview. Because sometimes, the person you least expect turns out to be the one who changes everything. Months later, an old video surfaced online. It showed Brian's first interview at Stratton Technologies. It showed the receptionist laughing at him. It showed the two senior managers mocking him as he was sent away. And it showed Brian standing quietly, adjusting his jacket, and walking out without a word. The video went viral. People all over the world watched and shared it. They called Brian the man they laughed at and praised how he rose above it. But Brian never commented publicly. He stayed focused on his work, his people, and his mission. Because real change doesn't come from shouting louder. It comes from showing up, working hard, and staying true to who you are, even when no one is watching. Years later, Stratton Technologies became one of the most respected companies in its industry. And every time a new employee joined, they heard the story. The story of the man who walked into an interview looking simple. The man who was mocked and thrown out. The man who came back, not to take revenge, but to rebuild what others had broken. And every new employee learned the same lesson Ethan did that first night. Never judge a person by their appearance. Never laugh at someone trying their best, because someday they might be the one giving you your next chance. And that is how one simple man changed everything. Not with anger, not with revenge, but with kindness, strength, and the belief that true worth is never found in clothes, titles, or first impressions. It is found in the heart.